All right, I wanted to introduce you to Richard Wallsgrove, and let's see here. A little bit about him. I'm going to read this bio off to everybody so we know. Richard is an assistant professor working with the Environmental Law program at the William S. Richardson School of Law. He served as the policy director for the Blue Planet Foundation and spearheaded the nonprofit's clean energy advocacy. Key successes included working to pass the nation's first 100% renewable portfolio standard, advocating to halt the expansion of the state's last coal generating station, which I believe is this year, correct? Co-founded the Drive Electric Hawaii Partnership, and creating the annual Hawaii Energy Report Card. He has also worked with the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy to analyze climate change adaptation tools for managing water resources in the Pacific. He was a co-editor-in-chief of the University of Hawaii's Law Review while performing field and laboratory research on the use of stable isotopes to measure biochemical markers of climate change. And Richard was previously a high school science teacher, teaching areas of environmental law, lawyering fundamentals, business associations, and energy law. So let's see. Oops. Without further ado, Richard, you have a slide, right? Presentation?
I do, yeah. If you could turn on the slide sharing, that'd be great.
Okay, there we go. You're good to go.
Well, thanks so much for letting me sit in on that. It's so inspiring to hear all the things that you are all working on. And they're all fantastic, but that Pearl Harbor bike path cleanup, if anybody was on, I think maybe Dan was on for my last set of slides, a bunch of the pictures came from that Pearl Harbor bike path because it goes right along an oil pipe that goes from Pearl Harbor out to the west side. So it's got some energy law implications, and it is probably the one area of the island most in need of cleanup. So thank you all. I think I might pester Pili to see if I can join.
Please do.
Okay, so give me a second here to get slides on today's topic. I just need a moment to get my screen organized. There they are. It's coming along. Sorry, one more moment. All right, there we go. With any luck, you can see both my slides and me, and we're ready to go. So thanks for having me back. Pili called me up, and I think she was trying to figure out who else she could invite to come and do these talks. And I angled my way in to come back because I want to talk about something that I actually don't know about. I want to talk about water law, which is not my area of expertise. But it just so happens on the day that Pili called me, I was reading through some of the documents in the various Red Hill cases. And I was so fired up in that moment. I said, you got to let me come back because I want to talk about Red Hill. And so I tell that story for a couple of reasons. The first is to give you a roadmap of where I'm headed. I basically just want to get into some of the text of these documents and show you what they say. I suspect there are folks here that know more about what's been happening, sort of on this day-to-day news feed that we're getting. But the legal documents tell what I think might be a slightly different story. Pili says, can't see my slideshow. Is that true? Oh, now we're back in. Okay. So the language of these legal filings, for example, the words disaster, crisis, and emergency show up in that order in the Department of Health's decision and order. Well, I didn't read that particular framing in Civil Beat, for example. The second thing I want to say is that because I expect there are others who know more about this, I want you all to please chime in. I'm not going to make any attempt to give a comprehensive overview of kind of all the facts. I just want to dive right into the pieces of the documents that get me fired up. So please, feel free to stop me or add in as we go along. I think that's it. I think with that, we can start. And in the grand tradition of law professors everywhere, I want to start with a pop quiz. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? Lots of no's. You can tell we're in Hawaii. Oh, wait. Nate knows what it is. No, even Nate.
Is that an oil spill in the early 1900s?
A good guess. A good guess. That's a river that's on fire. It's not necessarily oil. This is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, which caught on fire to sort of national news coverage in the late 1960s. And when I say it's a river that's on fire, it's actually not an oil spill. This is not sort of discrete spill that floated on the surface of the river and then caught on fire. This was a waterway that became so polluted over time with a constant discharge of stuff into the river that the river actually caught on fire. Mind-bending, in my view. Of course, we had known for at least years, probably decades before this, that this type of pollution was not a good idea, right? Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book that folks have read about that dealt with DDT came out 7 years prior, and a lot of the big environmental nonprofits we've all heard of, like the Environmental Defense Fund, they were all formed before this happened. But most folks who study environmental law say that it was this river catching on fire that actually gave birth to the environmental law movement in the United States. It was just 6 months later, right after this is on the front pages, that you get the National Environmental Policy Act. And then pertinent to what our topic today, the Clean Water Act pops up 2 years after that. We also get the Clean Air Act. We get the Insecticide Acts, Marine Protection Acts, the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. All of this stuff happens in just the 5 years following the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. I'm going to loop back to that at the end, but I felt like it was a good place to start just to remind us what environmental law is all about. Now on to Red Hill. So I think that here, most people are familiar with the facts, so let's just do a cursory overview of what's going on. These are massive fuel tanks dug into the ground up in the Halava Valley, like kind of behind the Halava prison. They were built back in the World War II era, and they were built by hand, essentially. I mean, hand and the equipment available at the time. But you can see here the laborers digging out the side of these things. They actually built the top of it first so it wouldn't collapse in on them. And then in order to reach the walls, they filled them with water, and there were guys in boats who actually floated up inside these big holes in the ground so they could test the walls of the tank. So some perspective of when I say they're big, what I mean is they're the biggest underground storage tanks in the United States. I'm not sure about the world, but I mean, I would figure big ones would be in the United States if they're anywhere. They're massive. Collectively, they hold nearly 200 million gallons of fuel. There are 20 tanks. There are 2 inactive. There are 4 under repair. They are big enough to put Aloha Tower. That's what this picture is from Honolulu Business or Hawaii Business Magazine. You could literally put Aloha Tower in there with room to spare into each one of them. And the way they're built is that it's the hollowed out rock. You've got then a layer of concrete a couple of feet thick. But what actually holds the fuel inside is a 1/4 inch thick piece of steel that lines the inside of that tank. That's all that's keeping the fuel inside, because if the fuel gets out of that 1/4 inch thick piece of steel, it's in the concrete, and the concrete is permeable. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to now see that maybe this is a bad idea, but to make it worse, I think the data point everybody knows at this stage is they sit about 100 feet over the primary aquifer for drinking water, fresh drinking water on this island. So a catastrophic failure would be a big deal. And this has been something folks have talked about, for years and years and years, if not decades. Back in 2018, they took one of the tanks that's now inactive, and they started to cut out small pieces of it to see what these liners look like, the steel liners. You can't inspect it from the outside, right? The liner goes right up against the concrete and the rock. And going inside doesn't tell you much about what the condition looks like outside, where the water is seeping in and perhaps causing corrosion. So they cut out a bunch of these, they call them coupons. Here's an example of one that was in pretty good shape, and the ruler there at the bottom shows that piece, they looks like the remaining thickness of the original 1/4 inch steel is still about a 1/4 inch. But other parts of the tank aren't looking so hot. Here's another one they pulled apart. They have some models. They predicted that this thing would have, 0.135 to 0.187 inches left. But actually, if you take, if you peeled off all the corroded bits of it, you're down to 2 millimeters left of this steel in this portion of the tank. So corrosion has been an issue, but it's not the only issue. Before 2018, in fact, part of the reason folks were undertaking this sort of careful review of the state of the tanks is there was a massive spill back in 2014, 27,000 gallons of fuel. The Navy at the time, they sort of defended the continued operations of the tanks by saying that that was the only reportable leak since we put underground storage tank, or UST, regulations in place back in 1988. The reportable word there is important. I know we have got at least one lawyer on the line, right? When you qualify by saying reportable, that's the only one they had to tell us about. But it turns out, we'll see in a moment, there were actually a lot more leaks than that. The 2014 leak, as best as anybody can tell, was a human error issue. It wasn't tank failure. It wasn't this corrosion on the side of the tanks. And in sort of defending the continued operations of the tanks at that time, the Navy said, well, look, we've got monitoring devices that measure the level in the tank down to a 1/16 of an inch at all times. And there's also this comprehensive groundwater protection plan in place, which monitors the soil in and around the tanks. And I'm not a hydrologist. I don't know all the other stuff they're doing, but this plan was in place. And this plan wasn't actually voluntary. The plan was a requirement of something called an administrative order on consent that they had entered into with the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency, and also with the State Department of Health. The stated purpose of this particular order was to minimize the threat of future releases. The word releases is driving me crazy. This is how we've sanitized the leak into the groundwater. We call them releases. So anytime you see releases, think to yourself, we're talking about a leaky tank. The reason there was this administrative order, I would think of it as a settlement agreement. Basically, in response to the 2014 leak, the State Department of Health, came in and said, look, you're violating a lot of the regulations about how these tanks have to be maintained. And in this global agreement to monitor things more closely, the EPA and the State Department of Health and the Navy all agreed on sort of these protective measures like the groundwater protection plan that got put in place. So that was a 2015 administrative order on consent. Oh, sorry, I should make sure I'm not going too quickly, and tell me to slow down if you'd like me to. I think that we should take a step back and figure out why both the EPA and the State Department of Health were involved in that administrative consent order. Most of these federal regulations, like the Resource Conservation Recovery Act that governs underground storage tanks, most of these federal regulations are administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. But in some environmental laws, in some particular areas of environmental law, like underground storage tanks, the EPA actually delegates its authority or abdicates its authority to the state. There's a trade-off here. The EPA says, look, in exchange for us sort of passing the regulatory burden onto you, State Department of Health, we will agree as the federal government to waive our immunity against state regulation, because as a general matter, federal agencies like the Navy actually are not subject to regulation by the states, right? Our governmental system works in the reverse order. So we have federal supremacy as opposed to state supremacy. So this trade has happened now that the State Department of Health has enacted a whole series of underground storage tank regulations in the statutes, HRS, and the Navy has agreed to waive its sovereign immunity, along with all the other folks that operate underground storage tanks. This isn't just regulating the Red Hill tanks, it's every gas station that's out there. I can't remember quite the number. I know in the United States, there are about 500,000 of these regulated tanks. I don't know how many there are in Hawaii specifically. Jump forward from 2015 when that administrative order was issued, a couple of years of looking at the tanks and those sorts of things. And in October of last year, based on some continuing violations of the administrative order on consent requirements, this Department of Health levies a $325,000 fine against the Navy for a list of violations. That happens in October. And it was for things like they weren't maintaining the rust protection properly. They weren't undertaking the tests that they were supposed to undertake. They were supposed to, there's a whole list. It's not that interesting. I'll keep going. I mean, you can imagine a $325,000 fine about a facility that people are already thinking about and talking about, got some coverage in the news. And so we could point to any of our news sources, but I'll use Civil Beat. And so Civil Beat and others start covering this, this fine. And there's a meeting of the underground storage tank assessment committee or something like that. I can't imagine how boring those meetings are. But in one of those meetings, you get the Navy defending themselves and saying, hey, we don't have to choose between environmental protection and national security. We can have both. That's the quote of this guy, Gordy Meyer. That's October, and you know where this story is headed, right? It's just a couple of weeks later, we find out that there's another huge leak out of one of the tanks. This time estimated about 14,000 gallons. The initial news that I saw in Civil Beat said, yeah, but the water's okay. There's no threat to the environment and the drinking water remains safe. Well, we're a few months on and we all know that didn't turn out to be the case, right? The fuel got into the water, and we'll look in a moment about how we figured that out. The state's response was to invoke that Chapter 342L, the state's underground storage tank regulations, which has a provision in them for emergency response. When something like this leak happens, if there is an imminent peril to human health and safety or the environment, then the governor or the Department of Health can order anybody to stop what they're doing or to change the way they're operating storage tanks. This applies to everybody, and this is what the state invoked in that moment in response to the 14,000 gallon spill, 14,000 gallon spill. There were other legal proceedings happening. There was actually an ongoing permit process because the permits have to be renewed for these tanks. Their Department of Health hadn't yet issued its decision on the Navy's request to renew its permit. That was going on, and the decision was actually probably expected right in the midst of this October-November timeframe. And so for the first thing I think we don't immediately see on the surface of the news coverage we're watching is that there's kind of a distinction between three legal processes. We have that ongoing administrative consent order. We've got this permitting renewal process. But what we get hitting the headlines in October, November is this emergency order. The emergency order says to do 5 things. It says to suspend operations, install a drinking water treatment system, then to submit a work plan and a schedule for defueling, submit that to the Department of Health. If the Department of Health approves that plan to defuel the tanks, then you have 30 days after that to pull the fuel out of the tanks. And then lastly, the order says conduct a sort of broader assessment of the design and operations of the tanks and report back to us on how you're going to avoid impacting the environment in the future. And the implication is if the Department of Health becomes convinced that the Navy is responding to the situation appropriately, they would allow them to refuel the tanks and continue operating, right? Kind of sending things back into the permitting process in that administrative order. In order to, the Navy was allowed to then invoke a right to a hearing. And so in early December, you get an evidentiary hearing where a hearings officer is appointed by the Department of Health, who listens to both sides, takes on testimony from all sorts of folks, from experts, but also from community members who are drinking the water. And this is where I'm going to bore you to death with text. And I tell my students never to do this, right? All good slide presentations should be pictures, but we need to read the text. And so I'm doing the work of highlighting for you what I think jumps off the page. The Red Hill facility sits directly above the sole source groundwater aquifer. Okay, we know that. The aquifer is irreplaceable. Well, we only have one of them in essence, even though there are different subsections of it, it's all the same water. And that's the principal source of drinking water for all of us. It's 77% of the drinking water on the island comes out of that aquifer. 20% of it, as you probably have heard, from the Halava shaft, which sits right down below when I say below, I don't mean below the tanks, but I mean sits in Halava Valley, just Mackay of where the Red Hill facility is. Over the past 80 years, 76 incidents involving 200,000 gallons of fuel. Again, we're calling them incidents and not leaks, but I think we know what we're talking about here. And the hearings officer, after hearing all of the evidence, decides, you know what, this is probably understating the actual number of leaks and the total volume of leaks. So not one reportable leak, as we heard from the Navy's sort of opening salvo, but a lot more of them. That 2014 leak was evaluated as part of this evidentiary hearing, and we find out that the Navy didn't report that for somewhere between a week and a month after it happened. And that when they said it was 1,600, oh, sorry, then I should jump forward. There was a leak in 2021, in May of last year. There was another leak. It was a 1,600 gallon leak. Although the hearings officer, after hearing the evidence, decides it was probably more than 1,600 gallons. And then again in July, so twice in 1 year, you get another leak, this time down at the end of one of the pipelines that flows out of the Red Hill facility at the Kilo Pier in down in Pearl Harbor. The November leak, the big one, the 14,000 gallons, at the time of the evidentiary hearing, the Navy wasn't quite sure what had happened. I think even today, people aren't quite sure. But the working theory is that somehow the May leak and the November leak were interconnected. It had to do with the fire suppression system. And then you've seen in Civil Beat that they think what happened is it flowed into an open hole in the bottom of a corridor in the Red Hill facility that nobody knew was there. It wasn't on any of the maps. It's a hole in the ground that flows down into the groundwater. Who knew you'd put one of those underneath a massive fuel tank? The hearings officer takes some exception to this state of affairs that we don't know where things are or what happened, and says the Navy did not state with exacting reliability what happened or why and how the release occurred. But on the other side of things, we get some pretty concrete evidence of how the victims, that's how the hearing officer characterized them, the victims who related their experiences in drinking what turned out to be tainted water. And he says that testimony was credible. And the most important part of what the hearing officer thought was a balancing test between sort of the impacts on the environment and people and the need to keep operating this facility. And this starts to break my heart. I've spent a bunch of time advocating before various public agencies. And my frustration most of the time is that they don't go far enough in sort of telling it how it happened. I think this hearing officer is telling it how it happened. He says the water coming out of the taps in people's homes, it wasn't just mildly contaminated, it was poisoned. 350 times the limit for water toxicity. Men, women, and children, the children part hits me, it really does, hits me hard, became seriously ill. People were headed off, some people had to head off for emergency medical attention. I actually have a student who lived in that neighborhood and drank the water, and she's told me firsthand about some of the impacts on her health, and it's just devastating. And then adding insult to injury, none of those monitoring systems discovered this. How did we discover it? People started waving their hands and saying, hey, my water smells like diesel fuel. People discovered for themselves based on strong odors of fuel emanating from the waters. It doesn't give me a whole lot of faith that groundwater protection plan was doing what we were promised it would be doing. The hearing officer describes this as a humanitarian and environmental disaster, points out that we don't know how long it was in the environment. We don't know how widespread it got into the aquifer. We just don't know the full extent of the damage. And we don't know what the impacts are going to be going forward. We don't know what the impacts are on the environment going forward. We don't know what the impacts on people are going forward. We just don't know, once this much fuel ends up in the aquifer, exactly what that means. Looking backwards, right, based on the evidence he had taken in, he says there's a history of leaking. The tanks will continue to leak. That on top of the operator error, and now it seems like both of 2014, the May and the November leaks were all operator error. But in addition to that, there's a serious corrosion problem that doesn't seem like we can address over time in the way that people have been considering prior to that. The probability, the calculated probability based on some expert testimony of an acute leak, somewhere between 1,000 gallons and 30,000 gallons. So something like the leaks we've seen this past year, that probability was quantified at 27% per year. Do the math, right? By 2010, we've got another leak. Not 2010, sorry, 2030, we've got another leak like the one we just had. And then in the long term, the probability of catastrophic leak, right, hundreds of thousands of gallons, is pegged at least 34%, which the hearing officer concluded was an understated percentage. The Red Hill facility is simply too old, too poorly designed, too difficult to maintain, too difficult to inspect, and too large to realistically prevent future releases. It's not just one problem, but a combination of problems. And in black and white, based on the testimony you heard, the hearing officer concludes the Navy cannot prevent future leaks at the Red Hill facility. So what do we think? You know, we bump that up against the language of the law, which says there's there must be an imminent peril to human health and safety of the environment in order for the Department of Health or the governor to undertake these, to sort of invoke these emergency powers. Do we think that it was demonstrated here? There's no question in my mind. Perhaps reasonable people can draw different conclusions, but the language of that hearing, the evidence in that hearing officer's order or findings, to me, just, I don't know, it just seems so abundantly clear. The Navy responds first to the decision of the Department of Health. Part of that response is legal. It says, the definition of imminent is not defined in the statute, and so they try to redefine the definition of imminent. And that's the job of lawyers. But I actually, and if we've got a Navy lawyer on here, I want to hear the response to this. When you put a sentence in there that says, quote unquote, there is no risk that the contamination at Red Hill Shaft will flow again to these people's taps, I do not understand how that's possible. I just really don't. And I want to acknowledge that perhaps it is possible, but I want an explanation. I feel like all of us are owed an explanation of how that's possible, particularly if the working theory is correct, that the May and November leaks were connected and we didn't know between May and November. How do I know that between November and the coming May or July that there won't be another leak? So Peely, just so you know, this is what I was reading when you called me up. It was in front of me. And that's why I was so fired up and wanted to come get everybody's thoughts on Red Hill, what's going on. I also, if we're taking issue with the way in which some of this response is characterized, recognizing these people are advocates, it's their jobs to zealously advocate for their client, the Navy. There's also a whole lot of sort of implication, subtext, that the state just doesn't have the authority to do what they're trying to do here. They say it's not the order that the Department of Health gave that binds the Navy to distribute safe drinking water. It's that we can't distribute unsafe water by law, and they cite the Safe Drinking Water Act. But here's sort of strike number 2 where I get fired up. This waiver of sovereign immunity that we see in some of the environmental statutes, that goes all the way back, parts of it all the way back to the 1970s and 1980s. And every time some state has tried to, invoke their power under that waiver of sovereign immunity, you find the federal government pushing back. These cases go to the Supreme Court, many times with a favorable outcome for the federal government, and then Congress has changed it to close the loophole. And then the next time the state tries to enforce one of these acts, it gets appealed again, and we got to go back to Congress. The strongest waiver of sovereign immunity, in my view, of all of those federal environmental statutes is in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the one that governs this particular process. So my view is that there really isn't any question that the state has authority to regulate these tanks. So we're left with the question of, do they have the authority to do an emergency order, or does their authority have to be do we have to wait and we can apply that authority in the permitting process in some other contexts? And the Navy's position obviously is there's no imminent peril here, and so we should do it in the permit. I don't buy that. I don't buy that we're saying, hey, we'll just go back, and if the State Department of Health says next week that we don't get a permit, we'll shut down quietly, right? It seems to me that there's also going to be some argument to be made in that place too. So we're kind of separating the arguments, in some ways engaging in semantics by thinking about whether or not imminent peril is the most important standard, even if my belief is that the imminent peril standard has been met here. A few weeks later, right, Peely's calling me, the media is calling me. I got to figure out how underground storage tanks are regulated, and I'm trying to read up on this stuff. And all of a sudden, we breathe a sigh of relief because we hear that the Navy agrees to comply with the order to drain the Red Hill fuel tanks. The Rear Admiral Blake Converse saying it's a lawful order, and so we're taking action to comply with that. And no doubt they are. They're certainly taking action to treat the water that's coming out of the wells that were poisoned. My assumption is there's some sort of work plan being developed that would comply with the order, but we don't know because that happens January 2021. And a couple of weeks later, we get an appeal filed with the courts, both state and federal courts. The Navy says that they filed this appeal just because they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose the ability to appeal, that they only had 30 days to appeal the order, and so they had to file something. I think there are some problems with that argument, but fine. Let's read the appeal and see what it says. It says the configuration and operation of the facility is not an imminent peril that requires immediate action. I think there are some folks that live up in the neighborhood who would disagree with you. There's no evidence that the November release was due to a flaw, hole, or other problem in an underground storage tank. Fine, but you've already told us that human error can cause these leaks. So why are we dancing around that issue? We're not talking about human error here. But overall, the idea is the state exceeded its authority, that these long-term risks are something that should be considered in other legal processes. My view is the Navy has an uphill battle here, that they have to prove the legal standards. They have to prove that the Department of Health acted in some arbitrary or capricious way. And it's hard to square up some of the testimony with the idea that it would be arbitrary and capricious. But no doubt those appeals at some point, they'll go forward, and we'll have to get a legal determination on that question. And that brings me all the way back to the Cuyahoga River. I got to thinking about this, and I realized something, that when those Red Hill tanks were built back in the 1940s or whenever, we thought this was okay, right? We were dumping stuff into rivers for another 30, 40 years before we all realized that was a problem. And I'm having a hard time squaring. You can hear I'm getting emotional. I'm not acting like a lawyer and being objective, but I'm having a hard time squaring up the idea that we can't just stop and say, we need to do something different. There has to be some alternative. And I'm not an engineer. I don't know what that alternative is. I don't know if it means that you can reconfigure the tank some way so that we know the corrosion is a problem, and to eliminate human error. It seems to me that the safer alternative might be to move things so that you're not sitting 100 feet above an aquifer. But whether we get there or not, I think turns on a couple of big questions. One piece that we should all be aware of is that even if the Navy's appeal fails, and the State Department of Health is found to have acted in a reasonable way rather than an arbitrary way, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act allows the Navy to appeal ultimately to President Biden or his successor, whoever that ends up being, if their argument is that, yes, we recognize this violates the law, but it's necessary for national security purposes. The law, that's what the law says they are allowed to do. I think I would be less frustrated if that was the appeal being made now. And then at least it's all sort of transparent. We know exactly who's making the decision. It comes down to one person. It would be President Biden's decision. We might contrast that with this idea of state regulation. And here's where the law probably is too mixed up for us to predict the outcomes. Our state law is very different than our federal law. Hawaii is characterized by the public trust doctrine and the right to a clean and healthful environment in our Constitution, which says that all of these types of natural resources, including water, they're held in trust. They're not ours. They're held in trust for our children. And the risk, in the next 100 years, 34% risk that we get a catastrophic leak from one of those tanks into our sole source aquifer that's irreplaceable. It seems to me it's hard to square up with our Constitution. And I just wonder if the federal government is going to respect where we sit as a state and community. So there you go. I'm more frustrated than I perhaps would want to be, but I would love to hear your ideas on what we do about this, right? As community members, what's our role in convincing President Biden that national security, perhaps at a time when national security is in the front pages, doesn't warrant the risks that we're being asked to borne here in Hawaii.
Richard, Dan here. Terrific recap. Actually, one of my good friends is David Franco, who's advocate on the permit process. So I have a lot of information from him. What baffles me isn't the legal side, it's the public relations side. Like, I don't understand the gain here if I'm the Navy, if so like, why? You're poisoning your own people. That's not good for morale. They're not happy. You've got, more than inconvenience. It's like the outcome is clear. So, maybe as a lawyer, you're not a PR professional, but why? That's the part I don't quite get, because you're gonna lose eventually. That part baffles me. So why take everything down on the way?
I'll take suggestions from others if there's a good answer. I can think of two. One is it could just be a sort of money and time thing. I was looking at, as of 2018, some of the alternatives that were evaluated for relining the tanks or moving the tanks. And there's a whole spectrum of costs, from the sort of tens, I can't quite read it here. It might be tens of millions, but it gets
Billions,
up into the billions
billions
for the
with a
relocation
B,
option,
yeah.
right? With a B. And we saw that, our congressional delegation has secured some money, about 100 million, to defuel the tanks, but we're not yet at that billions point. And so it may just be the public relations strategy is to buy time until either the money comes along or it doesn't. The more cynical view, and this is where it ties back into some of my own work and expertise. I compare this to something like climate change, where our federal government is not being responsive. We just really aren't. I mean, even with the sort of the move forward we're seeing from the current administration on some of those issues, we've known about climate for a long time, and we're just waiting for a Cuyahoga River moment before we actually do anything about it, is one way to characterize it. And so my fear is that we're doing the same thing here, right? The PR strategy is just draw it along until there's a catastrophe so bad that we can no longer contain it. And just like the atmosphere, I think our water resources, they can't survive that, right? We can't allow that. You got a better answer, Dan, or anybody else?
No, I mean, I posed it to David, and he says the Navy doesn't believe that they can replace it. That's their issue. They're convinced that the fuel is needed for national security, and they don't think there's another location where you can build above ground tanks. And I don't buy that. I mean, I've never looked at, what locations are available, but, you've got, and he's a politician. You got the lieutenant governor out there saying, Par Petroleum can store a third of this today. I don't know if that's true or not. And I realize the Navy doesn't like to rely on others, but, clearly, I think the word ineptitude comes to mind here. And the longer it drags out, the worse the public relations is. And it's not just the Navy, it's the whole military civilian relationship. And that's, in my mind, even bigger than this.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a silver lining in some ways, right? I was using the Cuyahoga River as an example. I mean, maybe this is the Cuyahoga River example where clearly we couldn't contain the PR fallout from that either. And thus, finally, there was, action at the congressional level. And so maybe we get the same thing here. I don't know.
Sort of a question. Thanks so much, Richard. That was great. That was very informative. It was much easier to understand than an array of news articles. What a question for the group. Why do you guys think, I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been more outrage about this issue. Do you think that it's just the nature of the issue? Do you think that people are kind of complacent and tired because of COVID? I expected much more sort of civil unrest from this.
Yeah, I think that for Hawaii, there's a lot of upset about it. And I kind of go back a couple of years when I got a flyer from the Board of Water Supply signed by Ernie Lau. And I'm thinking, Asian conservative engineer, and if he's upset, I better be upset. But I think there's also some resigned, it's the military, it's the federal government, they've stomped all over us before, sort of thing. But I think you got Ernie Lau out there. You couldn't have a better front person on this issue. So it's not the holy environmentalist. It's the, quiet engineer who gets teared up when he's talking about mission and water. Yeah, but this is about as radical as Hawaii gets.
I have another question for Rich.
Wait, so, Pili, can I reflect on Nate's really quick?
Yeah.
So Nate, I want to say I'm guilty of that, right? When did I read all of the news articles and I get upset about a lot of stuff in terms of environmental regulation, but this one didn't rise to the top of my list, so I forced myself into your meeting until I read those words in the order. And so some of it just might be visibility. Underground storage tanks are underground. If we could see it, it might make a difference, right? It's got one of those sort of pernicious problems, like many environmental problems, where it's too hard for us to keep it in our consciousness in order to get angry. So Earth Day had the first Earth Day back in the 70s after the river caught on fire, had 1 million people marching in the streets. I haven't seen that yet on Red Hill. I take Dan's point that I think we are seeing, certainly folks in that neighborhood are talking about it. Lots of folks are talking about it, but we don't have 1 million people in the streets yet. Sorry, Pili, I cut you off.
That kind of brings me to my question, and it's like, as a community or as a community service organizations, like what is the best way to approach issues like this? Like, is it good to march down to the city hall or the state, or is it good to sign the petitions, or like advocate for the bills or support? Like, what is the actual actions that people in the community can take to put pressure on those issues? Like, what can you tell us that is like the action that is going to have more impact and make things to move forward?
We should spend our time today brainstorming that, because I don't know, Pili. I don't know on this issue, but there's good reason for that. I would defer to Sierra Club, who's been pushing on this issue for years and years and years. And I think they've got a plan and they know it needs to be done. And Chemo Frankel's been, litigating the permit. And I think we should ask them that question of how we support them. I think that's really important. It was the same answer I gave to people I know who live there. I got the call and said, what can I do? How can I keep this in the public eye? And my answer was, there are people who are spending all of their time on that. And I don't think that we, as somebody who can, I can spend an hour on this a week. I'm not going to move the needle with any one particular action, but maybe I can sort of allow them to deploy my hour a week in a way that collectively moves us in the right direction. I wish I had a better answer on that one too, Julie.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, with the government involved, I think it's just a little disheartening and makes it harder for people to feel like even if it's the right thing to do, that they're gonna do what they're gonna do regardless of what they should do. And if it comes down to it, it's not, even if it's bad for the environment and bad for people and what have you, if they're going to put national security before us and the rest of the country, and they're going to just, like that mindset, I think makes it harder for people to feel like they're going to have their say or their efforts are going to make any impact, right? And usually it's like, okay, what can one person do? If you have to be that one person in the right position, but otherwise it's like, yeah, like Pili said, like, what can we do? Like, what is it that we can do? I think it's just a little discouraging.
That also makes me think of the climate crisis, right? An even bigger problem, not in maybe terms of the effect on us today, but a bigger problem in terms of how many systems around the world are contributing to it. And I've struggled for years to come up with an answer on what do we do there as just individual people. And I think the best I can conceptualize it is that that's going to require a steady force of change, right? We can't forget about it. It has to be something that's in our minds all the time, that we're talking about all the time. Just being here today talking about it feels, it's sometimes I think we do this and we feel like we are spinning our wheels and this isn't helping. But I actually think it is helping, because now, each of us had some time to talk together and maybe to crystallize some ideas we can share with other people. And it's part of that steady wind of change that comes along. I wish there were better answers to these.
Sovereignty.
No doubt that those issues are tied together. No
They
doubt.
are, and there's a lot of people, to be honest, there's a lot of people in this type of stuff is moving, not just, I would say, the Native Hawaiians and what they feel that they want to come back to. It's moving the needle for just Kama'aina and other people to start thinking along these lines. Like, people are wondering, is it, should we be separating ourselves from America? I'm just saying, those are the kinds of, solutions that people are coming up with. Yeah.
Did I cut off Jacob?
Yeah. So I know today Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii hosted a basically a civics lesson focused around, I think there are 2 bills currently in front of Ledge regarding the Red Hill issue. And so that's one thing that they're doing I think it is actually this evening, or was it 6 o'clock or something, but they're training people on, how to engage civically in order to, to leave public comment and get involved in the public hearings. I also know there's, it was Water Protectors Oahu is a group, or Oahu Water Protectors, that they've been actively protesting this issue. So you can follow them and see, when protests are and get involved there.
Those both sound like sensible things that we can do. And again, neither one of those is going to change one person's participation. One piece of testimony doesn't change anything, but that doesn't mean it's not valuable, right? I think we just have to change our conceptualization of what's valuable in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we are past 7. And did anybody else want to chime in? Ask any questions?
Christina, do you want me to go over the Genki ball thing from earlier, or no time?
How about I close the meeting for this part in the recording? And then
Sounds
we
good.
can jump onto that. I think, are we good? Is there anybody else dying to jump in? No?
I just wanted to say thank you, Rich, for connecting with us and for enlightening us. I personally was upset about the Red Hill just for obvious reasons, but I didn't have the background of all that was going on in the legal part. And you made it very easy for us to understand, and I like the pictures and all the effort that you put into the slideshow. And I was telling Nate that I think that we normal people can benefit a lot from talks like this, because it's very instructional and very easy to digest and to understand, and to see what's really going on. Because sometimes we come out, normal people like me, we come out just passionate, right, about the system sucks, right, this shouldn't be like this. But when we have the legal part as a background, it makes us more aware of why it's wrong and why it shouldn't be that way. So I personally really appreciate you taking the time to share all your knowledge with us.
Well, I appreciate the chance to come back. This is an inspiring group. I think that I learn as much as I teach when I hang out with you all. So thanks.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rich. And I'm going to stop the recording real quick and let me click close out. Let's see. Oh, that's not the right button. Okay, here we go.